Hey, what's up guys, my name's Fox and welcome to another video. In this video, I will compare raiding in Final Fantasy XIV to raiding in Lost Ark. Considering Final Fantasy XIV has been exploding in popularity lately and Endwalker is around the corner, I figured this is a good timing to compare the two MMOs and the different raid styles. For those of you wondering about my experience I have in the two games, I was a high-end and hardcore raider in Final Fantasy XIV, did blind progression on Savage and have obviously cleared all 3 current ultimates. I also did lock runs, optimization and speedruns. Arguably, I understood XIV raiding as much as you can imagine. For Lost Ark, I'm not as experienced as I have yet to clear the latest released raid in Russia. I so far only have beaten the new Kokol Satan aka Clan raid up to phase 2. Otherwise, I have cleared the remaining Legion raids. I get the question of comparing the raids to Final Fantasy XIV a lot, and obviously also difficulty of the two games. So before we start comparing the two games, I would want to ask you to leave a like and maybe subscribe if you're enjoying the content. With that, we're gonna start. The most important and biggest difference is of course the holy trinity of tank, DPS and healer that doesn't exist in Lost Ark. As you might or might not know, Lost Ark does have supports which can heal and shield, yet everyone also has access to healing pots that they are supposed to use while raiding. This plays a very big role in Lost Ark, as there is no such thing as raises. Sure, the Abyss raid Argos does have a limited amount of raises for the whole group, but with Legion raids, those raises are gone. aka, once you are dead, you will keep lying on the floor. In Final Fantasy XIV, you are able to be raised by a healer as many times as you want. I think this is something very important to mention, since it increases difficulty and the penalty you receive for dying much more. A dead person will not be doing any mechanics, nor will they be doing any damage. But let's get to the more interesting stuff and compare mechanics and combat. I personally like to explain Final Fantasy XIV's combat as a choreographed dance that you have to learn. The fights in Final Fantasy XIV just basically throw mechanics at you, one after another. These are stacks, in and outs, clock positions, pair positions, and many more. There are tank bosses that the tanks need to mitigate and heal checks where the healers need to top off parties. Most of these things don't really exist in Lost Ark. Yes, some raids have mechanics, but I perceive those mechanics as very simple if I compare them to Final Fantasy XIV mechanics. If we take Wormhole, a very complicated mechanic at first sight, and compare it to any of the mechanics I have encountered so far in Lost Ark, it makes them all look child's play easy. Sure, there's some other type of mechanics that I think are interesting at first, but so far I have yet to encounter a mechanic during my progression where I was asking myself how to solve this mechanic. But that doesn't mean Lost Ark is easy. Most of them are straightforward, in or out, stack here, go to here. Final Fantasy's mechanics though can be a huge puzzle or maze. Take for example Advanced Relativity from E12S. If you have never encountered that mechanic, you will sit there with a pen and paper and try to solve that puzzle that the developers put in front of you. That is why I believe blind progression in Final Fantasy XIV is the most amazing and fun experience. It is extremely challenging and requires decent brainpower to solve these riddles. But Lost Ark shines in a different category, and that's the combat. Final Fantasy XIV's combat is honestly plain and boring. The rotations can be mapped out on a piece of paper and you just apply them as good as possible. The whole fights are scripted, hard mechanics make bosses often disappear, so you don't need to worry about uptime. Unless I'm looking at you, Shiva. In Lost Ark, this is where you need the brain power. I like to compare it to Monster Hunter a lot. Bosses have indicators of what mechanic or what type of attack they're going to launch as the next move, and you have to react accordingly. This can just be some basic frontal attack, it can be an AoE around them, and so on. It can be many things, but it's extremely random. You need to fight for your uptime, and your rotation might change all the time due to different things happening. If I take the earlier comparison of a choreographed dance for Final Fantasy XIV to Lost Ark, well, this is rather a improv dance contest. It is messy, not scripted and not predictable. Maybe you just started your 4-second burst window and the boss decides to jump to the other corner of the arena. Yeah, these things happen. No need to blame your tank or anyone else for missing your back positionals. No, the game does it for you. It is very hectic and just completely different from Final Fantasy XIV. Now on to the probably most asked question. Is raiding in Lost Ark harder than it is in Final Fantasy XIV? Yes and no. I'm going to say the following. Blind progression in Final Fantasy XIV is probably the hardest raiding I have personally experienced. It is challenging and super fun and requires input of 8 people to solve certain mechanics. I also arguably would say that it's harder than any raiding I've encountered in Lost Ark so far. But, yes, there is a very big but. While blind progging raids in Lost Ark is not as hard as it is in Final Fantasy XIV, re-clearing remains much harder. The fights remain challenging, they remain attractive, and the bosses can always at any time surprise you with a new combo they haven't shown you yet. Mechanics sure become easier and more predictable, but they were never really the hard part or point of the raids in Lost Ark. It's all the other things around it, all the AoEs that are being thrown at you, and all the things you have to dodge. Deciding when to get your uptime on the boss, all these things make them hard. So re-clearing or doing non-blind progression in XIV is much easier. All the mechanics are solvable beforehand, you can learn them all, and all you gotta do is your homework. That is simply not really doable for Lost Ark. So overall, I would say Lost Ark's raiding is more challenging than Final Fantasy XIV's raiding, with one single exception, which is the blind progression in Final Fantasy XIV. I know some of you might disagree with the things I've said, and that's okay. We all have our own opinions of our favorite games, and I tried to be as objective as I could. Some people would argue that Lost Ark's raiding is harder than I described it. Others will argue XIV's raiding is harder than I described it. This is my personal opinion, and I believe both games have their own charm in their raids. Obviously, I have yet to clear the Abershrood raid that is already released in Korea and cannot give my input from a point of view as someone that has already cleared that raid. I can only give my input from a high-end hardcore raider in Final Fantasy XIV, comparing it to the raids I have done. And so far, I already believe that the Lost Ark raiding simply is more challenging. I feel like the ceiling is much higher. I feel that people that are unprepared and that don't care enough about raiding will have a harder time in Lost Ark than they have in Final Fantasy XIV. I truly believe that in Final Fantasy XIV everyone can clear an ultimate. All it takes is dedication and time. The mechanics are simply puzzles that you have to solve, and everyone can solve them. And I don't really believe that will be possible for Lost Ark, since it requires much more reactionary gameplay and much more paying attention to what's going on than Final Fantasy XIV. But I might just be biased, and all of this is wrong. Please take it all with a grain of salt, because currently I am obviously playing Lost Ark, so to me it feels like this game is harder than Final Fantasy XIV has ever been. Yet I could also be wrong. I also believe that difficulty is subjective and can be perceived different for different people. Yet I just wanted to compare the two different playstyles and where I feel that difficulties or differences lie in. Thank you so much for watching the video. If you did enjoy it, make sure to hit the like button. Also, you can subscribe and let me know in the comments below. What is your opinion? Have you played Lost Ark and have you played Final Fantasy XIV? Which one is harder for you? Which one do you think is more attractive, or which one do you think is more interesting? Thank you so much. You guys have a great rest of your day, wherever you live.